Engagement session in these 2 days. And we thought of organizing it as a round table, so no presentation, it's more like a conversation on a certain number of topics with people with different profiles that we have invited. So on my right side, your left side, we have Tim Fairhurst as a representative of ITOA, European Tourism Association, which is one of these like groupings that speak on behalf of the travel and tourism industry, and that knows quite well how to interpret the trends we have been talking about, the perspectives for the future from the point of view of the industry. And then we have Petra Stusek from Ljubljana, the destination management organization of Ljubljana, which is, I have to say, a quite well-known case of best practice in destination management. In fact, I was reminded that I have already met her because they invite her everywhere. When you need somebody from a good DMO, you invite them in this kind of events, but also because of our, of course, Slovenian partners who facilitated this connection. And then we have two academics who are experts in the kind of phenomena we are addressing. Here is Laura Collini from University of Venice. I have to tell you, somebody whom I have seen already also many times in Venice. I don't remember when or where, but you are familiar to me. But then we got to see her academic production, and also she has been telling me that she has worked on projects which are also very relevant for what we do. And finally, Josep Ivars from University of Alicante. He is one of our SMARTDEST partners, and he is our smart destination, smart city, smart governance analyst in our project. But beyond that, he is a professor that I, sort of to explain, I use as one of the main references in my classes. So that's who we need to have when we talk about tourist planning. And I have to excuse myself, I am a terrible roundtable moderator. The last time I did this job, it was also in Giudecca a few years ago, and the day after there was a newspaper article that said because of the moderator who did a terrible job, the whole thing was incomprehensible. So I will try to remind myself about that and keep myself to the minimum necessary. But I did prepare a certain number of discussion topics or discussion prompts. I'm not sure that we are going to have time to go through all of that. I think that the first of them, I would like to hear some short feedback from all our participants, and then on the others we can modulate questions and answers in function of your profile. And it would be good if you also have a conversation between you. So if you feedback on what your roundtable participants are saying. So I would like to start today with basically the main concern of our project, if I have to pick one, which is the situation about this entity that we call the resident communities of tourist places. Is it fair to say that the last few years, and I'm basically thinking before COVID, but we can also take the pandemics into this argument, is it fair to say that we live in a challenging moment in which maybe for the first time there is ample recognition that tourism might not be fulfilling its historical promise of being an agent of empowerment of local community, of upwards mobility of local community, a source of diffuse prosperity. But we are facing a situation in which it seems that it is happening all the contrary, that tourism is starting to grow in spite of local communities and with effects on local communities, which are most of the time disruptive. And I would like to hear your opinion from your perspective about this. Then we are going to go into what we make of that in your respective areas of work. Maybe I will start with you.
Great, that's a nice easy question to begin with. Thank you for the introduction, it's great to be here. And maybe for those of you who don't know about ETOA, just to clarify, we are mostly the private sector, but I'm very pleased to say I'm sitting next to one of our members as well. So we have about 10% of our membership, so 120 odd destination management organizations that could be national or destinations, so regional or local. So I think these sorts of discussions and all of the co-creation and the involving government and private sector and civil society and academics, all of that discussion is very much something we try and expedite. And I'm here to be a bit of a bridge between private sector and some of this debate. So thank you for the introduction. I suppose my first response to Antonio's question is it's asking quite a lot of the tourism industry to sort of carry that moral and almost intellectual weight. I mean, tourism is a sort of collective noun for people going on holiday. So what you're talking about, the challenges you describe, are absolutely planning issues. What are the laws governing who can rent what traffic is allowed where, what costs what is taxed. That's not tourism, that's governance. Tourism is private individuals choosing to spend discretionary money to go on holiday. So it's obviously a useful basket term to say, look, get some tourism stakeholders in here, but as we've discovered, there's all sorts of people. There's people who manufacture electric buses. Where are they? There's people so there's all kinds of people whose work or whose competence affects tourism, but wouldn't necessarily self-identify as, I work in tourism. So I'm out, I do work in tourism, and one thing that I would like to say is tourism wants to help. We're not here to go, don't care what the local community want to think, I want a great time. Tourism, and I'm sure Petra will echo this, you're starting to hear words like purpose-driven product, values-based product. People don't want to go somewhere and be thought, I'm not very welcome. I'm actually making a problem worse. Breaking news, some people are super kind and altruistic, some people are selfish. That's true of all the people who go on holiday as well. But it is certainly part of the dialogue inside industry. How can I find out which suppliers I can work with who've got a good relationship with their local community? Have they got a good story to tell about their hiring practices, about how they're a sort of good corporate citizen in their community? There's also the climate footprint. Which hotels can give me third-party audited carbon footprints? So increasingly, and I particularly speak for the B2B bit of tourism, and I'm going to use the word that's picked up once or twice this morning. Tourism can be an agent for change, all right? And I heard that from someone at Visit Scotland at an event 2 or 3 weeks ago, but you've got to work with it. So if you think, here is this huge economic mechanism that if it starts rolling in a direction that's useful for you as a community, it can deliver the benefit you want. It's got much more chance of doing that if the process is collaborative. Lots more to say, but I'll stop there.
Thank you. Good, is it morning or afternoon, I think already, to everyone from me too. Well, I come from Ljubljana, which is a capital city, but also a European Green Capital 2016, which is and still the only city in a vast area, like more than 1,000 kilometers away in all directions, the only city that was announced as a European Green Capital. Why? Because the European Commission claims, or recognized rather, that we did the most amount of changes in the least amount of time for the quality of people who live there. And I live there, and my colleague Dan is with me. We live there, and that's how we actually work. We work upon our, I don't know, the DNA actually, and that's what, you know, that's where everything needs to start. Going back to your question, definitely we live in challenging times, no doubt about it. Probably the most challenging in centuries right now, because everything is changing so quickly. But we professionals who actually work in tourism day to day see it differently, quite the opposite of what you just said, because from the first time, the whole ecosystem is awakened and is actually addressing the issues that are in the whole ecosystem. And I have to say that I would always emphasize that tourism as such is not, it should not be talked about in a negative sense only. It really is, and I will echo to what Tim said, it really is a catalyst for change if you do it properly. And more knowledge is out there to more and more destinations to do it properly. However, we just went through the major crisis with COVID, and we were full of how we need to do it organically now. We have a unique opportunity to grow tourism organically and to start from scratch. All the destinations are equal. Everyone is starting from point zero again. Well, guess what? We forgot it a year late. 2 years go by and we forgot all about it, and we are again with the comparison with 2019. This is where we need to start reminding ourselves it's a complete different world. We want to make it differently and stop with these comparisons with 2019. 2019 was different planet, was different century, was different everything. So now we really feel or believe, at least in Europe. I mean, I'm working a lot with Americans, some also with other continents, but in Europe we are very awake towards these questions, how we live in ecosystem and how we are more and more good practices and the actual practices on the field, how local communities are not participating or even worse, tolerating tourism. They are co-owning the whole process. And that's where you need to start, to make them not more than participants, to make them co-owners of the whole process. How to make that? Yes, it's easier said than done. But we really, I will talk in our name. We really are persistent in communicating with locals what is the benefit of tourism for them. We're actually proactive in that. We're making campaigns and to specifically tell them what does tourism bring to the benefit of locals. And we're not talking only about the the fact that local economy could not survive without tourism, and that is in the most cases of destinations, is that local economies, a lot of them could not survive without the foreign money coming in. So it's not only that, it's the events that are made for, that are financed from tourism. It's the infrastructure that locals are using, financed from tourism. It's the local bakery operating because of tourists bringing enough of money that it can survive. It's the local craftsmen surviving, and through that, and I will address that. I was of course very curious about the outcomes of the SMARTDEST, what you presented, and I will address the Ljubljana outcome as well. It's the local craftsmen who are surviving through that, through the cohesion of the ecosystem of locals and of tourists. And that, because you don't know the practical cases, might sound a little bit philosophical. We know behind every point that I'm making is a practical case behind, which I can go in very much into details. I'm here a whole day with pleasure. The point is, Just go out of your DNA, don't be afraid of it, make a good narrative out of it that would be appealing to locals but also to foreigners, and then you know, and then make this, how should I say, products, not tourism products, products that would work for locals and for tourists. And I'm emphasizing it's really easier said than done, but it's possible, and we are a living proof of that, and we're really proud of that.
Thank you, Petra. Josep, maybe?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation, for the introduction. I'm going to talk from the planning perspective. So, going back to the 90s, to deal with sustainable tourism, there was a model that was used above all in UK and New Zealand, called the DAY1 model to sustainable tourism. The DAY1 model integrates 4 components: the visitor satisfaction, the industry profitability, the environment preservation, and the community well-being. If we apply that model from that decade until now, the community well-being probably has been lagged behind, because the priorities have been to attract and to satisfy visitors and industry profitability. Nowadays, due to the pressure that several cities are suffering from tourism, it is necessary to make community well-being a priority. And this is connected with the need to widen tourism governance. And in this approach, I think there are several new projects, such as the collaborative project by Group NEO about the democracy. The democracy in the sense that we cannot consider, as was said before in the introduction, the tourism policy as an exclusive sectoral policy. It's a transversal policy that requires an integrated type of planning and management, and this is the challenge. But participatory planning is not easy at all. And you, as experts in the industry or in the DMOs, you know that to catch the attention of people to participate is very difficult. We have experience in our city labs many different situations, as the case of Amsterdam, of participation fatigue. What is true, I think nowadays, and above all in these big cities we have analyzed, is we have overcome the tokenism in planning, in tourism planning, the symbolic participation. So, but we have in front of us the challenge of going from tokenism to empowerment. And we can use the participation spectrum in order to self-analyze the situation of many cities. Are we informing the community? Are we consulting the community? Really involving the community, collaborating with them, or empowering them? And this is a long way, and there are uneven situations according to the local context, the socioeconomic context, and the degree of pressure of tourism. And what I would like to highlight here is there is a dominant discourse about over-tourism as a generalized situation. And this is not the case. There are many DMOs in which the priority is still to attract visitors, above all in low season, to improve occupancy rate in formal accommodation. And we cannot take the picture of over-tourism as a generalized one in tourism. I'm thinking about rural areas, medium, small cities, coastal destinations, where it's important to highlight this balance of the DAY1 model is still a priority in terms of improving tourism activity at that places.
Thank you, Josep. Please, Laura.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. It's one of the first time that I'm introduced as an academic, considering that I came back to academia 5 months ago. Just to say that I have been working as an expert for the European Commission for about 20 years on urban policies, and I've been working for 2 programs. One is URBACT and the other one is Urban Innovative Action. And in the meantime, during these 20 years, I've been working mostly on social exclusion and social inclusion and housing and migration. So that's my area of work, not necessarily tourism. But I've been working for the European Commission on an initiative that was called the Urban Agenda, a partnership on culture and cultural inclusion. And we had one part of the work around tourism, and we worked also with the DG Growth in relation to the better regulation of Airbnb. And so I became acquainted more closely with what the tourism sector is. And why I say sector? Because I don't think that is a sector. From the perspective of the urban policies, it's very hard now to understand the composition and the dynamics of tourism without understanding the process of changes of urban setting and the commodification. So you cannot separate these two. And it's part of it. You know, if we talk about tourism, we also have to understand what are the process of commodifying the cities. And when you ask the questions of what is the effects of tourism, I think we need also to ask what is the effect of changes and commodification in cities, and seeing cities as cash machines, as an engine of production of surplus capital. And so I think that the mechanism that tourism considered as a sector put in place are the mechanism that we can see of exploitative measures that we see on cities. And they're all effects that we see on residents. The idea, it's interesting to see that you separate residents from tourists, because we are all tourists in one way or another, and we don't go to visit cities only because we have holidays, but we are here also because we work. I come from another city, by the way, hyper-touristified cities, which is Florence, and I come here and I work here, but I'm a tourist at the same time. So you see that you have different identities at the same time on the concept of residing a place and also using a place in many different modalities and in different temporalities, which I think that's very interesting concept that some of people here are working on. Giacomo, for instance, has been working on a temporality. They have also to be considered in this mechanism of exploitation on cities. And all the effects on exploitation on cities in terms of creation and recreation of poverties and recreation of exclusionary mechanisms are in place when we talk about tourism. And so the effects on tourism on this population that has different forms and different aspects of identities are detrimental, because we see this as in terms of accessibility of services, in terms of housing accessibilities, and so on and so forth. But we all like to see places, to see cities, and to be mobile, and so on and so forth. So I come to the point that my colleague before was saying, because she was repeating many times, that you need to handle this properly. So, and you said that information with the local community, to the municipality, information to the local communities, how this properly might mean, or what does it mean sharing benefits. I think it's the most important questions. What is appropriate, considering that the detrimental aspects are in place and are part of this permanent crisis, as some people have been called, the period that we are living?
Yours. Thank you very much, Laura. I think that we have now an opening perspective on the issues, and I think that in part also Tim covered my second point, and I maybe would like to pick it up again. The tourism industry does its job, being more or less in tune with ideas of making places work better to the benefits of all. And if we are, as we are seeing the increasing challenges for social inclusion, yes, there are cases in which this could be under control, but again, as Josep said, the trend is there that there is more and more places where this is out of control. And Barcelona, which is my natural point of observation, has gone through this process in spite of politics. So the question would be, it is not, I agree with him, it is not the job of the tourism industry to manage to govern all that. It is the job of different levels of administration to come up with solutions. It is the job of all the value chain of tourism to find new ways to operate in a more sustainable scenario. But we are not seeing that in the majority of cases. So this need to keep things under control is basically not happening, and maybe it's just a question of numbers, it's just a question of pressure, it's just a question of forces that are out of control. But don't you all think, and I will make these questions to you, that there has to be a fundamental change in policy to understand fully what is happening and to come up with novel ideas, novel concepts, and novel paradigms, novel ways to measure what is happening. I still think, as I said before in my introduction, that the urban agenda, even at European level, until now has capitalized very little on the idea that mobilities, tourist mobilities, transnational mobilities, which we tend to see as a positive social thing, can have disruptive effects for the local level. So do we need a fundamental revision of policy thinking and then policy instruments to come up with some solutions to what might even not have a solution? New round. Maybe I'll start with
Okay, thank you. I'm a little bit reluctant to that. I mean, of course we need regulations, and I strongly believe that EU is not doing enough as a commission, I mean, in that sense, in the regulatory sense, saying in one case is that it's the discretion of their members, and then they cautiously regulate something, and then the members finally push. So yeah, the regulations would have to be in place. However, I strongly believe that we've managed to throw ourselves out of balance. We really, really managed to do that, and now we're realizing that and trying to reach that balance. Again, if I go out of my destination and some of other destinations that this is working very well, there are several important key issues. One is the visionary leadership of the local authorities, but the second one comes already from the DMOs, which means that if we have the power, we do have the power to bring the stakeholders together in a way that they don't only know themselves, but they really recognize the work of each other's and start to collaborate. What I mean by that is, for example, we've been doing that for years. Myself, most of the time the mayor as well, and my colleagues are meeting with different stakeholders on different meetings every year, like with the hotel owners, with the tourist guides, with the local shops, with the receptionist, with the NGOs, with whatever we recognize our stakeholders are, we gather them together, we explain them what we were doing together last year, and listen to them what their wishes are for the next year. So this is kind of a B2B that really, really fosters changes, and that's why I'm very confident to say that's what it's echoed in a way, that when we do the service among the locals, Constantly, the satisfactory with tourism is over 60%. I'm talking already pre-pandemic area now again. That's one thing. And the second thing is, when we are monitoring the social media, we see that we are way above average on the European level with the tourists coming into Ljubljana. But by tourists, and I very much agree with you, I mean that Slovenians as well, and even us in Ljubljana who are using the tourism products. In a nutshell, if the local community feels well in our surrounding, we are the best ambassadors, and that radiates out, and that's why the tourists are also very fond of destination itself. So regulations definitely, but the smart ones in the communication with different stakeholders and with local community. So not just regulations as such, or even regulations because it would be because it would work in some other destination, you know. However, on a European level, there would have to be some more specific guidelines that would address the common challenges in the destinations.
Anybody wants to feedback on this?
Sure, and you know, part of my job is getting involved in regulatory stuff in Brussels, so maybe a little bit of an EU perspective as well. But I think just to sort of address your question and the urgency, and look, you know, what are we going to do about it? It feels like a crisis was what we were picking up a lot this morning. I think it's worth taking a step back. At least part of it is due to rate of change. So, I mean, cities have changed all the time. That's what cities do. You know, there's religious persecution in one place, people move to another place and start weaving and set up a whole new industry there. Things change because of, you know, people, history, geography. What's happened in the last 10, 15 years has been super accelerated by digital distribution. So, you know, there is a lot that is, you know, technology moves much faster than the regulator. That's just a fact of legislation. So if you want to push back against things, absolutely get involved in the regulatory mechanism. But what moves fastest is what we're doing now, is identifying good practice and share it, because it's going to happen faster than mandated behavior through regulation. I mean, just to give you one tiny example, Europe is still working on 1973 version value-added tax arrangements that affect tourism. You know, you might think this is totally irrelevant to what we're talking about. It isn't, because the package of all of that covers all the margins of every single tourism product that is sold. It covers duty-free, and it covers tax on passenger transport. Now, the EU 27 all have to agree, otherwise it won't change. And guess what? Getting 27 countries to agree when there's differing impacts on certain rules is hard. And that brings me to the sort of, I think the key insight is that because a lot of European legislation is sort of privileges single market, competition and so on, it doesn't give room for what I would call sort of intelligent discretion locally. So back to your hometown, Florence, I asked the director of the Bargello Museum, well, she's a super director, so not just the Bargello, you know, when she's talking to people in the local community, you know, what's that like? And she said, the thing that gets me is I talk to Florentines and they say the last time they came to the Bargello was when they were at school. They don't come as adults, very few. I said, well, why don't you have an aperitivo in this fabulous building every month or something? Just get the local community involved in the cultural assets more. But one of the problems is it's not possible to give a nice deal to the locals and not give the same deal to visitors because of EU anti-discrimination law. And you think, that's dumb, we should fix that. It ought to be possible, just like they do in the States, to charge less for locals to visit Museum of Modern Art in New York than they do for visitors. So there's plenty that could be looked at an EU level which would enhance local discretion. So there's tons to say in there, but just inside the digital piece, and it picks up on, I think, Antonio, you were saying that you know, smart is potentially dangerous and it sort of focuses on short term, but you know, we can't put the genie back in the bottle, right? So digital literacy is something we've got to help everybody with in order that they can access what is distributed digitally, because that is how it happens. So there, you know, by all means feel free to opt out, but you really are being excluded if you can't access that. So, and that's not a tourism thing, that's one of the two key pillars of the EU, digitization and supporting that transition, and that includes a lot of digital literacy for everybody.
So I'm going to take some feedback from Laura, and also I will take some feedback from Josep on what Tim has just said.
Yes, I just want to say something that the matter of regulations at the European level are extremely complicated. And it's true that they are 20 years behind, but it's also true that, you know, the European Union in many aspects has absolutely no competence and no power, especially on everything that concerns social policies. So in the soft laws, it's strong, but not on other measures. And so, but I don't want to get into the point of the regulation. What I want to say is that I actually do believe that policies at local level may make a difference. And they may make a difference when I think that they don't consider tourism as a sector in itself, but they integrate it together with other policies. I think a good example would be the city of Ghent. The city of Ghent has a plan for 2020-2025 on tourism, but the first pillar of this plan is that tourism has to be integrated with all the other policies. And I think Ghent is quite interesting as a case in itself. They have been very progressive in terms of housing. They've been one of the first cities, for instance, that committed to the shift of the UN Special Rapporteur on housing. They have been working with an international project on housing first, supporting homeless people. They have been also very progressive in creating new departments inside the public administration on migration when there was the you know, again called crisis, but it's political crisis starting from 2015. They also have invested on commons and a new regulation of commons. So you see that the idea is that the concept of tourism and the planning around tourism is taken as a sector per se in this case, but inside this, they coordinate this with all the other policies. This doesn't mean that this is the perfect cities. For instance, one of the inside action of the plan is that they base their idea of distributing the flow of tourism. They say 42% of the inhabitants are unhappy with tourism concentrated in the city center. So that's also another topic that will come out in your questions, like which areas are more hit by over-tourism compared to others. But anyway, so they say, well, it's the city center that is more hit by tourism, so we need to redistribute the flows. This is another aspect that I'm not expert on, but it's, I think, highly complicated of, you know, redistributing flows of tourism in other parts of the cities that are until now preserved or saved. It's also interesting that this plan, and coming back to this best practice, they also involve different forms of tourism. There are, you know, of mobility. I'm sure that in 3 years of your project you look at that, like walking and you know, accessibility for people with different disabilities and so on. So, I mean, the whole idea is that local municipalities can actually do a lot and can do a lot also in terms of regulations. And I think these two things have to go together. You cannot just look at the point of regulating at a European level, national and local, but how do you see, how do these regulations are sort of socialized and make available and active working with local policies. Last example, the city of Bordeaux in relation to to regulation of Airbnb. They use an old law that was in the time of World War II, that you could not change the destination of, of premises from residential to something else. And they included a law that was some years ago. I don't know if they changed in our research that we did with Ugo Rossi. They said that, for instance, if you own an apartment and you rent a second apartment in Airbnb, you need to make sure that you have another apartment for long-term rental, secure in a certain way that you have that you secure that there are people that can stay and inhabit that place for a long time. So, as a message, yes, for regulations, there is creativity on creating new regulation that can be implemented at local level, using also laws, like in this case of France, old laws at national level. But you also need to have very illuminated local policies that are able to integrate tourism with all the rest.
Thank you, Laura. Josep.
As you know, we conducted in the SMARTDEST project framework an analysis of the relationship between the smart city and tourism governance. And at a first glance, it is very interesting to deal with these kind of issues we are talking, the intensive use of technology and data to manage the city. So the smart city promise is a very interesting point, and is a field of opportunities. But what's happening? What we have seen in the case study cities, there is a huge disconnection between the smart city development and tourism governance. There is no synergy between both processes, in spite of the fact the integral or the holistic view of the smart city can provide many benefits to tourism management. Another additional problem is that the evolution of the smart city showing us is it a concept out of fashion. So now in many cities we have studied, the smart city project is in a process nearly to dissolution. Everybody is trying to go beyond the smart city, to become the idea of technology, at least as an end. From this point of view, it is very important to highlight that knowledge-based management, it is a very relevant point to use evidence to manage your city better. This is the concept linked with the learning destination, the learning city. And I think this is one of the best approaches to the smart city. But is this happening nowadays? We are losing this opportunity of the synergistic view between smart city development and tourism governance. And as the City Labs in SMARTDEST are showing us, we must conceive the smart approach not as a technical approach, but a socio-technical approach. There are many European Union-funded projects based on a triple helix that are involving industry, administrations, together with universities and research centers. But there is a fourth component, the civic society, that is not well represented in this kind of project. And what are interesting from the lessons we gain from the SMARTDEST project is the idea of working closer to local society. And above all, to make a reflection going far from the idea of technological solutionism in solving the question for what we need technology, for what we need big data. What are our real needs that are different between many cities? And instead of an universal solution for every city that we can read in many official documents, the Smart City project, or as we defend in the SMARTDEST concept, the smart tourism city governance must be above all place-based. And geography matters. In order to evolve to better cities, and in order to apply this idea of of smartness, that I think there are many interesting components, but must be rethink in order to provide this focus more prioritized in social innovation. We have seen this evolution in the European Union funded projects. 10 years ago, they focused above all in ICT's networks, and now they are more close to these social innovation projects as our city labs.
Thank you, Josep. I just want to tell the audience that we are going to have a little time, well, some time for questions and answers. So we will also take some questions from the audience at the end. So I will. We are basically covering most of the points that I had in my list, but maybe the next round it's going to be a little bit more speculative questions, even though it's like backed up by the kind of research and the data that we put together in this project. And don't take me literally, because when you deal with statistics, you have to know that there are very big variations, but at least in the case studies that we could matter. Let's say that we are going towards a future in which at least the big historical centers of the great tourist destinations are embarking in a trend of population loss. So the Venice exodus is something that is being generalized. It certainly was before COVID, and in our project we have arguments to say that it's coming back after COVID because nothing has substantially changed in this negotiation for place. So can we imagine, if this is the thing, and I'm certainly that there are counter examples we can make, but can we imagine these places, their whole city, but especially the historical course of cities, going towards what, for example, Giacomo in his works called the short-term city, an urban form that is only populated by transiting population, short-term population. What does this tell about social spatial inclusion, inequalities, but also in terms of continuing attractiveness for tourists? Are the tourists of the future attracted in the same way in a center of Amsterdam with half of the population that it has, in a center of Venice with those few who will cope with this? I'm aware of the fact that I'm, as usual, screwing up my moderator role now in this moment, but can we imagine this kind of future, the future of tourist places that are basically losing their population below some kind of critical mass? Or is there going to be some natural counterbalance in this process, provided maybe that people who are residents, but not the type of residents that we are accustomed to think about, residents that are temporary? Maybe I will start in this case with Laura.
I mean, it's a difficult question because it requires, a crystal ball. It's a very difficult question, but it's a question that I think we all need to think of. I was looking back in my mind of, the first thing that came to my mind when you asked this question was the Truman Show. Which is so excellent. It's been such an excellent idea and showcasing what could be actually our future lives, or televised lives, or lives in transient, continuous, and where is the real life? If we will have a city like Venice that is for short term visiting, then it's like, where is the real life happening? And then the next connection came to my mind is a paper that we wrote a long time ago with some friends when I was in academia in Florence. and that was called The Musification of Florence. And at that time, we were not talking of over-tourism. We actually were talking about the gentrification of the city. Also, at that moment in Florence, we were talking about the students foreign students coming to visit Florence for a short period of time. But we also analyzed the fact that the apartments that were there available for residents were split into 2 or 3 apartments. So you had large families that were reducing for the sake of earning more through the rent. They will parcelize or reduce the square meters into, and transforming one apartment into 3 apartments, for instance. So I think there are, as I was saying before, there are ways to stop this Trumanization, if I can use the way, this post-apocalyptic imagination of having the cities like hyper-musified, or turning into Disneyfications, and having Venice just for visiting for a few days. And the way to stop it is really to have the counselor that spoke at the beginning here to be aware that her city, it's a wonderful place, but she doesn't have to sell it off. I mean, I've been invited with the new research group in the city and the University of Venice to study a case in San Pietro. And in this case, there was it's an old premises that has been, in a certain way, there was a tentative to sell off this place for using it as a co-housing in a certain way, but it was another form of hotel, high-end hotel, and the people reacted against it, and they also stopped the process. But the counselor who was here today, and I'm sorry that probably she left, she gave an interview saying that this was a co-housing project. I mean, we need to make sure that the people that represent us in the municipality are accountable, and they are totally aware that if they sell off not only in monetary terms, but also in symbolic terms. The symbolic tourism that they sell off their cities has incredible consequences for the inhabitants, and they have incredible consequences for this nightmare that you imagine. I think it's a nightmare of a city without residents. And so there are different ways of making these politicians more accountable, the different ways of creating public policies that functions, and that there are like a shared consciousness that we all need to reclaim our places in our cities. And to respond to as you said, that you prompt me to respond also internally to our conversation, to have measures of local discretion, it is possible. Actually, coming back to your example, it is actually happening in the city of Florence. You enter museums with reduced prices. People are not necessarily informed about this. And again, I come back, it's the work of our representative and politician and governors to make information available and to stop this mechanism of selling off to whoever is ready to pay.
For me, actually, it's not a difficult question, and the answer is very clear: no. Because it fascinates me how the same people who would like to live who would like to live in peace in their communities would go and travel and see exact must-sees that everyone else does, and of course explore also the other aspects. I mean, I'm not saying that tourism cannot cause a lot of issues in a lot of destinations. However, I do have to be a devil's advocate, reminding that it creates jobs, it opens minds, it's intercultural exchange, it brings joy, it creates atmosphere in the local neighborhoods. And like I said, we managed to throw ourselves out of the balance, but we are going to keep fighting to keep this balance back. And can we just for 1 second go really to the core of what over-tourism is? I realize there are some destinations that have physical disability or parameters that cannot be, the place just cannot be extended. For example, Venice is definitely one of these destinations. But in majority of other destinations, there are certain spots which are overcrowded, overpopulated, whereas different spots are completely empty. So we're talking about, not about the over-tourism as such in the majority of destinations. We're talking about the really bad management of flows and lack of good narrative to bring people someplace else, or good people people making events, or even playful architecture or street furniture in some other destinations that would enable people to, I don't know, go there, be fascinated, socialize there. There are so many tools we're not using, but I'm emphasizing there is more and more knowledge on the field that actually is going towards there. So I have to emphasize it very clearly. I don't believe that cities are going to die out, because we're going to keep fighting for that balance, because it's in our nature.
You share this, Tim, that the future of citizenless cities is not happening, or anyway, it's not in the interest even of the tourism industry to have that?
Well, it's an oxymoron. If it doesn't have citizens, it's not a city. So look, I mean, some of this is, we're skating over some really big strategic issues, but in no particular order, visitors to Europe, particularly people coming from outside Europe, want to enjoy things that Europeans enjoy. So if so the idea is that, if you visit London, London's got a very vibrant theatre music scene because the domestic demand is high for theatre, music and stuff. And the people who visit London can participate, right? It's not driven by visitor demand, it's complemented by visitor demand. And that's what we saw during the pandemic. If you take away the visitor demand, there was a partial collapse of the entire service economy because it's complementary. But it is contested. So, people have got money and they can buy. And I think I don't know whether it was a public property that was being potentially sold or a private property, but, rules governing who can sell what, is that the civil code or is that local? Are there other measures, as Panama talked about? So it's licensing and other sort of measures which can be coercive. But local politics is hard. You're really close to the people who put you there, and taking coercive measures which are going to make you have less money and you vote for me, that's really difficult. So I think one of the challenges we've got is maybe changing the planning horizon, because certainly my view of, and I follow mayoral politics and local elections quite closely because it affects decision-making about tourism a lot. There's a coalition in government in Amsterdam. There's a very big spectrum of opinion inside that coalition government. That makes the people who've got Petra's job in Amsterdam really difficult. How do you keep moving if the political direction keeps changing? So we sort of need to, as far as this is possible, depoliticize and extend the horizon for planning what good looks like, build a consensus for it with the community, with the stakeholders, thinking about the people who you want to be living here in 20, 30 years' time. What's the voice of the future generation? Are they going to be happy about the decision you made today, or are they going to think, idiots, you had your chance, you didn't make it? So, I think there's a lot of the co-design we've talked about, the good practice, I think it's there, but it needs to be embedded in good practice in local governance, because the easiest thing to do is to react to the loud voices and run for political cover. That's what happens, that's reality. And unless you've got a longer planning horizon, we're just going to keep going in circles.
Josep, do you want to feedback also on?
Just to highlight 3 ideas you have mentioned. Three points that have been mentioned. Tourism is not the evil. It's a matter of proper planning and management. Then we need integral thinking and transversal policies. Maybe housing policies are more important for avoiding the city centers to become theme parks than tourist policies. And the only solution to this wicked problem is to use participatory planning techniques, co-design, the idea of planning with and not planning for.
Thank you very much. So we are going towards the end of the time allotted to us, so I would like to, anyway, keep 15 minutes to take questions from the audience to whoever or to specifically some of our participants, and maybe I will give the...
We'll give the mic to whoever has a question. Anybody? Question, please?
Thank you. So, in your opinion, what can citizens do to participate actively to this balancing dance act so that there is enough in the city that it's there because the citizens want it and because it's useful to them, but there are also enough services so then when tourists come, they are aided in the navigation of the city, which is not something that, of course, citizens would need, but that how can we do it? How can citizens help in the creation of this harmony between the two parties? I know it's a very tough question, but
sorry, before you take the microphone away, can I just ask you, I know it's a general question, which city are you from?
Venice.
Okay, you're local, great, thanks.
Shall I start? I'm not sure, when you were saying balance, I think sometimes it's a mistake to assume there's two sides. So I think it's just a big, messy problem. And there are lots of competing interests. It's not just two, it's lots. But I think what I've taken from good practice examples that I've seen, and just down the road from Ghent that you're talking about, so Bruges is an example. Flanders generally does a lot of good work. So if you're interested in how does citizen consultation work and how do you build consensus and long-term buy-in to a long-term plan, Flanders has got a lot of good practice, and it's in the public domain. I can send you links if you're interested. So, I would say there's multiple ways of doing it. Make your voice heard, but I think, and this is easy for me to say because trained as a mediator and it just seems a good approach. I think anger is useful, but only as a short-term thing, not as a permanent thing, because from an emotional intelligence point of view, people shut off. So if you just go, you're the bad guy, you're idiots, you're ruining my city, people stop listening, even if it's fair comment. So I think it's important, emotions need to get involved. This stuff matters to us, but then we've got to find a really sort of calm way of getting the people in the room saying, look, what are the competing interests? And what does good look like, according to you, in Venice in 2030, 40, 50, in terms of demographic, in terms of the sorts of jobs that are available, and what are the mechanisms that can change it? Is it Kafoskery developing here more interesting things? Is it the startup culture that we heard about earlier? What's going to widen the tax base beyond tourism? The fragility is being too dependent on one thing. So it's not that tourism's bad, it's just it's easy to be lazy and go, well, we're fine, we can eat off tourism. That's not enough. So I think what we heard earlier, I would say any vision of success in the future is, it's not one or the other, as I said. There's plenty of tourism which drives local business and feeds local makers and disperses spend around the lagoon. I mean, we work with a network called Venezia Autentica, which some of you will know about, had some really cool ideas. It's hard to monetize it. And one of the things you need to do is to find people, like some of our members, who go, that sounds really cool. How can I scale that? Is it definitely going to be working next year? Because I'm selling my vacations to Americans now for a holiday in September 2024. Is that going to be happening in the lagoon then? And some of it is about product development on the tourism side to encourage the dispersal, but I think a big bit is encouraging away from dependence on tourism.
I'll just, chip in. I mean, that type of questions, like of engaged citizens, I have to say honestly, make my heart sing. However, not a lot of them are like that. No, this is a vast minority of them like it. I do hope you've been asked how you can contribute. However, if you are not asked, please just be persistent and speak out constantly and constantly and constantly. From our side, we are delighted. We're communicating with local, because we really believe that we first are, even though we are tourism board, our first job is to work for locals, for us who live there, because that would make a destination a desirable one. So we are communicating with locals in many ways, and we're making these workshops, and usually they don't speak up. They're just, I don't know, afraid or feel meaningless or so. Just be persistent and speak up what your wishes are. We've just yesterday, the day before yesterday in the afternoon, we have had one of the focus groups with locals, asking them various things about the events that are taking place in Ljubljana. And the response that we got was so precious, because it reminded us one more time that what we think that the locals or even tourists think is not necessarily true, And the same is when we ask children in the primary school, we do as tourist board, we ask children in primary school to write down the invitation to Ljubljana to their peers, to children from other countries. And it's, again, such a valuable information. How do they see, the youngsters, their destination? Sometimes we can even distract what their future wishes are be. There are ways, but it's the communication is the key. But not communication as such, but the one that really takes place between several parties, and they really listen each other. And I have to be honest, it's not all roses in Ljubljana. We have issues too, but we really are honest in these communications. And if we don't do something right, we just admit it, thank for the correction, and try to do it in a better way, or do it in a better way.
Thank you. Maybe I will take
one more question, someone?
Thank you. I'm curious if any one of you has any opinion how remote work and digital nomads or long-term stays, how this is affecting everything that we were talking about today. I mean, you were talking about. If anyone has any opinions.
I will be short. It actually meets our strategic goals, which are long-term stays. So it's desired. However, it's again an ecosystem. If it's working only for this purpose, it's not going to work. The whole regulation needs to be compliant, which in our case is not.
I can tell out of the examples that I've seen in Orbach projects, because we had like Orbach 3, something like 365 cities working on different topics. I remember that they were mostly small, medium-sized cities, that they had local policies or local action plans directed to attract remote workers, digital nomads, whatever you want to call them, because they see them as new opportunities for revitalizing the cities and for attracting inhabitants in areas that are demographically shrinking. And obviously, I mean, this idea that we were saying before, we're talking very much about over-tourism because we are in Venice, and it's kind of obvious, but if you go outside of Venice, you have Veneto region that is also affected by a high demographic shrinkage, and like many other cities and small, medium-sized cities all over Europe. And so for some of them, for instance, in the study that we did for Urbact, we had 12 cities asking them what their relation with short-term rental, and some of them actually answered, we would like to have it, we would like to have more, because we like, whatever, Dronskinskaya in Lithuania, they were saying we would like to have more. And so this idea of having digital nomads has been kind of attractive for them. I don't know. I mean, I really don't know if it makes a lot of sense, honestly. But that I just give sort of the picture of what I've seen, that this is a new topic that became part of city policies. If this is going to creating a temporary cities even more, I don't know.
If I am the moderator, I can also give my opinion on that. I think that what makes a digital nomad or a temporary dweller rooted into a city and become the source of like human and social capital that you're losing out on other dimensions, out of structural weaknesses that you still need to address. But what makes these people root in a place is quality of place, quality of services, quality of place. I mean, you can work in remote, but you still need the services. You still need to have a lively environment. In some cases, this clicks with the DNA of a tourist city. In others, it doesn't. And when I think about Venice, that is my city, I think, why should a digital nomad stay here for more than 2 weeks? After having enjoyed immensely these 2 weeks, because I am the first one to know that Venice is a great place to have fun, to party, to become a Venetian for a short period. But then I'm thinking, because I try to do the same reasoning myself, would I come back to live in Venice? Say no. So there are some problems that need to be reverted even before we think of repopulating with digital nomads. And this is all part of this new balance that has to be found between cities that are attractive and cities that are resilient, which I think is the big challenge for the urban politics of the future. But then I'm not moderating. So.
Answering your own questions. It is almost time. This is supposed to end at 1:30. Do you have any more questions before we break for lunch? Giacomo, Dosio? Poi cosa volevi che dicesse qualcosa per forza? No. Let me just say a couple of things about the Venice case. There's a screen there that shows a poster of the results that we've achieved so far. It's in the door on the left, so if you want to take a look and then talk about it.
This is only the academic papers from our project which are accessible open source. But if you go on our website, there is everything. So.
Yeah, so there's a QR that you can use to get all the papers, and our poster / screen is on in the door of the first office to the left, so you can take a look at that. I think that's a good time to give you some instructions for lunch. There's lunch boxes for everybody in the cafeteria outside in the next building. Grab one and continue the conversation in the courtyard. Each bag has everything in it. There's extra water if you need it, but there's already a drink in every one of the bags. And so please, let's do a round of applause for the panel of the